Welcome to the Joy of the Truth, the broadcast where we try to uncover the treasures of the Catholic faith. I'm Jeff Arrowood, your host. Today we're talking about the gift of marriage. Today's discussion on marriage centers around Amoris Laetitia because there's been a lot of conflict and even some scandal surrounding this document, which is the post-synodal document of the Synod on the Family. And last week we talked about conscience, and we took a look at some excerpts from Amoris Laetitia. And again, some of those excerpts were good. They were very truthful. They were right on the money, and some of them were a little weak and maybe even confusing, especially the statement that said that the natural law is not meant to be understood as a list of binding rules, but as an ideal or an inspiration, as an inspiration to good living. Well, I took issue with that. We're going to do kind of the same thing today. This is not going to be a stark criticism of Amoris Laetitia, but I want to show you some things that it says that is very good and where it kind of goes off the rails and gets people concerned. But along the way, as always, I want to be uncovering the goodness, the treasure of our faith. And so what we're talking about today is the treasure of marriage. And the treasure that I want to uncover for you is something that we should all know, but I find fewer and fewer people really do know. I just ended my term with the Office for Marriage and Family Life out of the Diocese of La Crosse. And in my time with them as a natural family planning educator, I was also very much involved in marriage preparation. And we found that many, in fact, most of the engaged couples who were coming to the church for marriage didn't understand the truths I'm going to share with you today about what marriage is as a sacrament and as a vocation. And so I want to make sure that we know that and we are living that. If we're married, this is something that is a treasure that can be uncovered over and over and over again in deeper and deeper levels within our marriage, and keeping our marriages not only alive, but making them more sacred and more Christ-like. So that's the goal for today. So let's first take a look at Amoris Laetitia. We'll take a look at the chapter that causes some problems in people's minds. And that's chapter 8. Now, I decided not to go through all the highlights and everything, but let me just give you a synopsis of what chapter 8 talks about. Chapter 8 is about the pastoral approach to marriage. And one of the things that it focuses on is what do we do when people fail to live up with what the document calls the ideal of marriage, the Christian ideal. And the ideal, of course, is what I'm going to talk about in the presentation tonight. And it says some very good things. So first of all, it says that we need to recognize that we can't put everybody who gets divorced or everybody who has trials in their marriage into one category, that each story is individual. There are different reasons for people to separate. There are different reasons for people to get a divorce. There are different reasons for people to get divorced and remarry. And what we need to do is we need to, Pope Francis's favorite word, accompany these people and bring them to the ideal. And I'm very glad that he said that in this document. It isn't just to accompany them to make them feel like the church hasn't abandoned them and that they're not alone, which is the sense I get listening to some people talk about chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. That is just, being with them is what accompaniment means. Pope Francis makes it very clear that the purpose of pastoral care, the purpose of accompaniment, is to bring them to the truth about marriage. But we need to first meet them where they are. We need to see what conditions are present in their life that brought them to the point where they are. and help them to deal with those conditions. So for example, if they're living in a second relationship, they've been married, they got divorced, and now they're either civilly married or they're living together with somebody they're not married to, and they have children, and they feel that they need to be together for the sake of the children. Well, those are concerns that a good pastoral approach would take into account and offer support for. Not writing it off and saying, well, okay, you have children, you need to be in the relationship as it is, we'll just let it be. But to say, hey, here are ways that we can support you in taking care of your children. Here are ways that we can move you toward getting your marriage, getting you married sacramentally. Okay, so that's really what chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia is saying, and it is for the most part very, very good. What I have on the screen here is one of the articles that causes a little bit of confusion, and most of the confusion actually takes place, believe it or not, from a footnote on this article. So yes, a lot of the debate and argument in the church today is about a footnote. But it's not saying that it's not important. It is, because the footnote does seem to indicate something that needs clarification, and we have not gotten that clarification. But let's take a look at what this article says. It says, I'm in agreement, I being the Pope Francis, I'm in agreement with the many synod fathers who observe that the baptized who are divorced and civilly remarried need to be more fully integrated into Christian communities in the variety of ways possible, while avoiding any occasion of scandal. The logic of integration is the key to their pastoral care, a care which would allow them not only to realize that they belong to the church as the body of Christ, but also to know that they can have a joyful and fruitful experience in it. They are baptized, they are brothers and sisters. The Holy Spirit pours into their hearts gifts and talents for the good of all. Their participation can be expressed in different ecclesial services, which necessarily requires discerning which of the various forms of exclusions currently practiced in the liturgical, sorry, wrong screen there, okay, in the liturgical, oh, it jumps around and I lose my spot, sorry, okay, let's see. Okay, various forms of exclusions currently practiced in the liturgical, pastoral, educational, and institutional framework can be surmounted. Such persons need to feel not as excommunicated members of the church, but instead as living members able to live and grow in the church and experience her as a mother who welcomes them always, who takes care of them with affection and encourages them along the path of life and the gospel. This integration is also needed in the care and Christian upbringing of their children, who ought to be considered most important. Okay, so this is problematic simply because it is bringing into the discussion of welcoming them and walking with them the ecclesial services, and especially the liturgy. And the footnote talks specifically about the sacraments in the Mass. So if somebody is divorced and they are remarried, as we're going to talk about in a minute, in the Catholic Church, you cannot be married sacramentally twice. So if you're divorced and you are still sacramentally married and then you get remarried, you are actually in an objective state of sin. Now, what Pope Francis is saying here that I applaud is we shouldn't just throw the book at them. We shouldn't just I don't know if you're familiar with the story, the Scarlet Letter, where a woman is caught in adultery and she has an A branded onto her chest and she's ostracized. It takes place in a Puritan colony. She's ostracized for her sin. Well, that's never been the Catholic approach. We don't ostracize people for their sin. We shouldn't. Sometimes we do culturally, but that's not the teaching of the church. But there are times when we excommunicate. And excommunication is a disciplinary measure. Sometimes it's a formal excommunication, sometimes it's informal. And it's meant to let a person know that they have brought themselves out of communion with the church by living in a state of sin, by living in a state of scandal. They have actually excommunicated themselves. And the declaration of excommunication is telling them, you are in danger. You are not living according to what Christ wants us to do. You're not living the life that Christ wants for you. So you are in danger. You're putting your soul in danger. And if we ignore that as a church and just let you go on as you are, you could end up in hell. So the excommunication, again, it can be formalized by when a bishop excommunicates somebody formally, or in this case that we're talking about here, somebody who is divorced and remarried, they're kind of de facto excommunicated because they are living in a state of perpetual sin in adultery. And so the church tells them, this isn't okay. You need to make sure that you are getting out of that sin, okay? So the concern here is if we get rid of that because we're afraid it stigmatizes people, then we don't give that warning. We let people get comfortable in a sinful situation without giving them the warning that they need, that they're in danger, that they're in spiritual danger. That's why this is problematic. Now, if you read into this that we need to be more accepting and more loving and not completely exclude them, that's a good thing. So I'm not talking about complete exclusion, but I am talking about making sure that they follow the rules on receiving the Holy Eucharist and the rest of the sacraments. Okay, that's a very important part of the church's, and it is part of the church's pastoral ministry. It seems cold and harsh to us in our modernized society, our modernist society, that wants to say anything goes. But that excommunication, that's saying that you cannot receive communion if you have mortal sin on your soul, that is a loving pastoral thing. So the question that I would like to ask is, how can we let these people feel welcome in various aspects of the church? They mentioned here, education and prayer services, other ecclesial services, without sacrificing the power of the sacraments, without exercising the meaning of the sacraments, and without writing off original sin or mortal sin as something that's not a big deal. Okay, that's really the issue here. All right, and you might be thinking, what's the big deal anyway? It's just marriage. And if you're thinking that, you're the kind of person I want listening to this, because I want to review why this is so important in the first place. What is the treasure of marriage, and why does this become such a sticky issue? All right, so that's where we're going next. And I want to focus on marriage as a sacrament and also as a vocation. And these two are actually very united to each other. I'll explain that in a minute. I just did a class for my parish called Living the Sacraments. And in that class, we talked about each of the sacraments and how each of the sacraments is a dialogue between Jesus and us. Jesus starts the dialogue by giving us grace in each sacrament. And that grace is signified through the sacramental sign. What that grace does in our souls and empowers us to do is signified in the sacramental sign. And then we respond by cooperating with that grace. And each of the sacraments actually has within it a vow. And in Latin, the word for that vow is actually sacramentum, where we get the word sacrament. And that vow is our vow to cooperate with grace in order to live out the sacramental sign. So let's take a look at that. What is marriage, holy matrimony, as a sacrament? And what is the vow? And that's where we're going to talk about vocation. Well, as a sacrament, marriage is the sacramental sign of Jesus' love for his church. We see this all over the place in sacred scripture. It's actually in the Old Testament when God talks about his covenantal love for the Hebrew people. Many times it's in the context of marriage. In fact, so powerfully that the entire mission of the prophet Hosea is to get married to an unfaithful prostitute and have her cheat on him and then take her back into his marriage again and forgive her, only to have her cheat on him again. And God is making the point through Hosea, this is you, Hebrew people, you are the prostitute. You are constantly being unfaithful to me, and I take you back, and you're unfaithful to me again, and I take you back, but I will always take you back because you are my beloved spouse. Jesus makes this a very, very firm sign and very clear sign throughout his ministry, and it culminates in the book of Revelation. When at the end of the book of Revelation, John sees the new Jerusalem descending from heaven, and he says it's as the bride adorned for her bridegroom. And so that this sign of marriage as a sign of the covenant between Jesus and the church is very, very strong throughout sacred scripture. But what does that mean for us as married people? How do we live out this sacramental sign? Well, we live this sacramental sign by living a relationship that reflects Jesus' relationship with us. And the church has identified three main attributes of Jesus' relationship in the covenant with us as a church. And I just grabbed three single verses to kind of give you a little bit of proof texting here about what these being part of his relationship with us. But the church doesn't often proof text. The church sees this as patterns in the relationship that Jesus lays down in the new covenant. So the first is that the relationship between Jesus and his church, the people, is free and faithful. And the church is always called this faithfulness, but in the wedding ceremony, it uses the language of freedom. Are you here freely and of your own will to give yourselves to each other in marriage? And that giving part is a very important part of the vow. We always focus on the freedom part because legally, before you get married in the church, you need to the priest needs to discern that you are free to marry. In other words, you're not being coerced, you're not doing it against your will, and you're also available to marry. You're not already married, you're not ordained as a priest, you haven't taken other vows that might get in the way of getting married. So the freedom part is often focused on in marriage preparation, but it's the free giving of yourself that really makes this a reflection of Jesus and his love for us. Jesus says when he's being arrested in the garden, I think this is, in John 10:18, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down freely. And he, again, this is a pattern of him from the incarnation through his healing ministry and his teaching ministry to the cross and even beyond the cross in the ascension and the giving of the gift of the Holy Spirit. Jesus shows that his relationship with us is a total donation of self. He gives himself to us completely. So that's what marriage is supposed to be a sacramental sign of, that complete gift of self. Secondly, Jesus' relationship with the covenant, his covenantal relationship with the church, is everlasting. And this is the point of Revelation, that there is this great revelation, the unveiling of the New Jerusalem coming down from the heavens. This is the eternal, never-ending covenant. And again, this is a pattern throughout the sacred scripture, and in the New Testament, especially with Jesus, that Jesus is, for example, the king whose kingdom will never end. Okay, he's the fulfillment of the promise that God made to King David, that your dynasty will never end. And Jesus says himself, "Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age," before he's taken up into heaven, before he ascends into heaven. So that's why marriage, to reflect this covenant, is till death do us part. Because on one hand, we have the faithfulness where we are supposed to be giving our lives to each other. And that doesn't just mean, dying for each other right in the moment. It means pouring ourselves out for our entire lives until death. But also the fact that we are committed to each other, that we are going to put this relationship, this covenantal relationship, as the number one thing in our lives, right? That's what the covenant with Jesus is. Well, for us, our relationship with Jesus needs to be number one, but close behind that is this covenantal relationship of our marriage, that it needs to last till death so that we can pour ourselves out and have that commitment that Jesus has to the church. And then finally, the marriage is life-giving. Jesus' relationship with his covenant is always giving it life. And this is obvious through, again, his ministry, through his healing and his teaching, where he gives his people life through his forgiveness of sin, and especially through the Holy Eucharist. He gives himself so that we may have life. And in John 10:10, that's what he says. I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. And this life has been seen in the church's history. St. Augustine's the most famous for pointing this out, as reflected in the life-giving love of a man and a woman who in marriage give birth to physical life, have children and a family. And St. Augustine even says that this is how marriage not only reflects the covenant that Jesus has with us, but also the Holy Trinity, that the man and the woman have love for each other, and that love takes on new life, just as the Father and the Son's love take on new life of the Holy Spirit. And there have been some great work, especially by Dr. Scott Hahn, who look at the Trinity and look at this idea of covenant and see in it the concept of family, that the Trinity is family, that the covenant is a family relationship. Okay, so for a marriage to give birth to family, that's what it means to be fruitful. It's life-giving. So those are the three ways that the marriage reflects the relationship of Jesus. Now, Amoris Laetitia in chapter 8 makes the point that this is not easy to do. And it says that the weakest of our brothers and sisters fail to do this. Well, I would suggest not to focus so much on the weakest of our brothers and sisters, but to admit that we're all weak, that this is not just an ideal in the human sense of an ideal. This is an impossibility for human beings. Not that I'm saying it's impossible for two people to live together in harmony for the rest of their lives, but to truly reflect covenantal love, to truly reflect the love that Jesus showed to his covenant by pouring out his life, by dying on the cross, that's what we're called to. And that's not humanly possible. But that's why this is a sacrament. And so we are given the sacramental graces to make it possible. So, I often hear priests talk about the sacramental graces as, just help by God to get through the tough times, to get through the arguments and to stay together. And there seems to be a very natural view of marriage. And part of that is because a lot of marriage is natural. I mean, we just live our life together. But the grace of the sacrament of marriage is meant to take us beyond just that natural survival, I guess you would call it, and make our marriage something greater, something supernatural, a supernatural sign of Christ's love for the church. And that is really what the grace of marriage is all about. Now, we respond to that grace through our sacramental oath, the sacramentum. And that oath is articulated in the Sacrament of Holy Matrimony through the vows that we take. And they're the same vows we just went through. The vow to be faithful, to give ourselves to each other freely. The vow to be permanent, till death do us part. And the vow to be fruitful. Okay? So those three sacramental vows make up our sacramentum, our oath. But this really is a vocation. It's one of two vocational sacraments, Holy Matrimony and Holy Orders. What do we mean by a vocation? Well, a vocation means a calling. And the calling, according to the Church's constant teaching, but most recently articulated in the Second Vatican Council, the universal call for holiness that is in the document Lumen Gentium, which is the sacred constitution of the Church. This calling to be holy is the calling to obey Jesus' command to love one another as Jesus has loved us. As I said, Jesus' model of love for us is the cross. And St. Paul talks about this in Ephesians, where he talks about needing to give up our power, to submit to one another. Because in place of power, we need to bring love into our relationships. We need to sacrifice ourselves. We need to be completely self-giving to each other. That's the vocation. And this is a universal vocation. Every single baptized Christian is called to love one another as Christ has loved us. Now, if you have a vocation to the priesthood, you are called to exercise that love in the context of your pastoral ministry. If you are called to the vocation of religious life, you are called to exercise that love, first of all, in your religious community, but then also in the love for the world through your prayer and sacrifice for the world. If you are called to the vocation of marriage and family life, you are called to exercise that love within the context of your marriage and family first, and then going out into the world to spread that love. So that's what we mean by vocation. Okay? So St. John Paul II calls the family the school of love. And he means this mainly as, children learn how to love in the family from their parents. But I would say that the more I've reflected on the Pope's thought and writing on this, and the more I've reflected on the sacrament of marriage, the more I realize that a vocation is a school of love. We tend to treat marriage, and actually any vocation, the priesthood, religious life, we tend to treat that as the end of a journey. I mean, think about when we celebrate a wedding. Don't we get together and our attitude tends to be like, yay, they finally found Mr. or Mrs. Right. Yay, they finally found true love. Well, anybody who's been married for more than 5 years know that that is not true. Marriage is not about finding true love. And I think this is one reason we have so much divorce, is because we set up this expectation that once you get married, it's all supposed to be perfect. That you're supposed to have this perfect partner and you're going to have perfect love for the rest of your life. And if you don't, well, you must have married the wrong person. Well, that's not the way the church sees any vocation, let alone marriage. This is a training ground of charity. And marriage, the wedding, is the beginning of your vocation. So when I teach this stuff to young people, I talk about the different kinds of love. There are 4 different kinds of love according to the Greek language. And the last kind of love is agape, which is the love that Jesus, we're talking about here, the love that Jesus shows. And I go through each kind of love and I define it for them, I give them examples, and then I ask them a question. I say, do I have this kind of love for my truck? And the answer is yes for the first kind of love, and then no for the next 2, okay? Do I have this kind of love for my wife? And the answer is yes for all of the first 3 kinds of love. And then I get to agape, and I say, do I have this kind of Christ-like love for my truck? Obviously, no. Do I have this kind of Christ-like love for my wife? And they think because they've said yes 3 times already, the answer's got to be yes. So they all say yes. And that's where I say, careful. Do I pour myself out completely in self-sacrificial love for my wife every single day? And the answer is, I'm trying. The answer is, I'm working toward it. This is my training ground. I'm not perfect in charity. I'm not perfect in this Christ-like love. I am not called to be perfect yet. I'm called to grow in selfless love. So when we're talking about Amoris Laetitia and this idea of accompaniment, this should be the attitude for everybody. Even those who have so-called successful marriages need accompaniment. We need the church to come alongside us and encourage us to keep growing in charity. And that's why marriage enrichment is so important and is horribly neglected in the church today. To come alongside couples who are married and say, let's work on making your marriage stronger. Let's work on more self-sacrifice and more selfless love and more of the three vows that you took on your marriage day, being faithful and permanent and life-giving, living those more perfectly. Right? Everybody needs that. So whether you have a successful marriage or whether you're in a divorce situation, everybody needs that accompaniment, that pastoral care, because this is what we're called to. And it's not possible by human standards. It's only possible by cooperating with grace and by persevering in growth. So really, we are all in the same boat here. That's my message. We are all in the same boat. So no married couple should look at a divorced couple and say, you guys blew it. Absolutely not. We are all in the same boat. We're all growing in charity. We should all be looking at each other and saying, how can we help each other to grow in this vocation? That's really the answer. And I think that's what Pope Francis seems to be getting at in Amoris Laetitia, just that he runs into some unclarity. Now, this is getting into the part where I think we enter into something really, really beautiful and very, very misunderstood or just not known in the church. And that is the fulfillment of how marriage and family life is the sacramental sign of Jesus' love for his church. Because there's another part of the sacramental sign that I didn't mention before. A sacramental sign brings about what it signifies. It's not just a sign like, hey, that represents this. Isn't that nice to think about? It's a living sign. Because of grace, it actually makes it happen. So when you're baptized, you are washed with holy water, you are actually dunked in the old rite, you're dunked in holy water. And that is, among other things, it's a sign that you are being cleansed of original sin. Well, that action, whether the water is poured over you or you're dunked in the water in the baptismal font, that action makes it happen. The sacrament actually does cleanse you of original sin. So when I teach marriage prep, I ask the question, how does marriage bring about the love of Christ for his church? And most of the time, people can't answer that. They were never taught this. And it's beautiful. So I teach it, and I want to teach it to you. First of all, it starts with this idea that we are in marriage to learn to love one another selflessly. So a man and a woman come together in marriage, and they grow in selfless love. And as they're growing in selfless love, they're creating this environment of love. Okay? And then what happens is they bring new life into this environment of love. Notice how this is embracing all three of the sacramental vows, right? So they're bringing new life into this environment of love. And then they bring that new life to the love of God through the love of their family. So we love our children. We teach them what love is. As Pope John Paul II says, the school of love for children is the family. This is the first place where they learn what love is. And if they're learning what love is, true sacrificial love, they're learning who God is. And then we bring our children to the sacraments, to baptism, and we bring them to the love of God, and we nurture their love for God in the context of family love. So this supernatural entity of the family brings about what it signifies. It makes God's love for his church a reality in the world, first in the family. Okay, then as that family grows in love, they go out and they serve the world in love. So, if you think about who are the volunteers that are out there serving the poor, feeding the hungry, fighting the good fight for pro-life, most of them are families. Right? And that's the way it should be. The family goes out and brings the love of Christ into the world. So that's how the sacramental nature of the family comes about. That's how it's fulfilled. Isn't that beautiful? I just love that. So that's the ideal. And again, I want to caution us. Pope Francis likes to use this language of an ideal. And again, I don't fault him for it, but I do fault the way some people are interpreting it. Some people are interpreting this as the ideal is something that's impossible to reach. And you just need to get as close as you can, and then you'll be forgiven for not making it. No. Actually, the ideal is something that is impossible to reach without grace. So what we need to do is get to the end of our own strength and then reach out for grace. And we need to move into that ideal. We need to make that a goal, and it can be a reality if we cooperate with grace. Okay, now it won't always be a reality. We do slip up, and that's why part of grace is mercy. That's why we get forgiveness. But in order to receive that mercy, we need to be dedicated to making it right and getting back on track and living that perfection. So let me end with a word to any of you who are watching this who are divorced and perhaps divorced and remarried, or divorced and looking forward to being remarried. Okay? So first of all, you are not irretrievable sinners. The church has not rejected you, and that's the message of Amoris Laetitia. Go talk to your priest, but go there with the dedication to do whatever is necessary to make things right. Okay, so that might mean that if you're divorced and remarried, that you need to go and seek an annulment of that first marriage. I should probably do a little bit. I don't want to get too far into what an annulment is because I'm already at quitting time here, and this could be a very long conversation. But an annulment is not Catholic divorce. What an annulment says is that for one reason or another, a condition of the marriage being a sacrament was not there. And so a declaration of nullity says that the wedding and the couple at the time of their wedding, the sacrament has been examined and found lacking in what's necessary for it to be a true sacrament. And that could mean that there was a shortage of intention on the part of the couple or one of them, that they didn't intend to be married forever, or they didn't intend to be faithful from the very beginning. It could mean that there was something wrong in the way the marriage was performed. There are a lot of reasons that a marriage could be considered unsacramental. A marriage is assumed to be sacramental until a nullification process is begun and the marriage is examined. Okay? So if a marriage is considered unsacramental, in other words, it's annulled, it's considered null and void, because it was not a sacramental marriage to begin with, it doesn't mean that you were living in sin. It doesn't mean you have illegitimate children. It doesn't negate that first relationship at all, because that's what I have come to call it, a good faith marriage. There was an assumption there that it was a valid sacramental marriage, and you worked through that marriage as best you could. And again, it's kind of even the language of Amoris Laetitia, doing the best you can with what you had. But you were lacking the fullness of grace because it was not sacramental. Okay? So once you get an annulment, you are not, it's a declaration that you are not sacramentally married after all, and therefore you are free to get married. You're not getting remarried, you are getting, sacramentally speaking, married again. It might be a second civil marriage, but sacramentally you are free to get sacramentally married because you were not already. Now, what happens if they find that your marriage was sacramental? Well, now you are in a situation where you have to make some decisions, some hard decisions. And that's, again, what chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia talks about. That you should not be abandoned in that decision. You should be supported. Okay, so it might be a decision that your second marriage can't remain, or that you can't enter into a second marriage because you are still validly married to this other person. It doesn't mean you have to go back to that person and live with them. It certainly does not mean, I have no idea where this ever came from, because I do not find it in any church teaching that you have to remain in an abusive relationship. That's ridiculous. But you are still sacramentally married. So what happens if you're separated from your spouse that you're sacramentally married to and you're not going to get back with them? Well, you are still responsible for their salvation. So you need to pray for them, right? And if there is still a relationship there of any kind, through your friendship with them, maybe even evangelize them, bring them into the fullness of the faith. So, but praying for them, don't underestimate the value of that. Now, what if you're in a difficult situation where you have children and you're in a second marriage, and for the sake of those children, you need this stability? That's where Pope Francis said, go talk to your priest and work things out with them. And they can examine your particular circumstances, and they can get you to the next step of making that not a sinful situation, of making it as good a situation as possible, right? And maybe even getting you to the point where you can have that marriage regularized and sacramentalized. Okay, that's what the Pope is saying there. So we need to be working with each other to do the will of God and to live out the beauty of sacramental marriage. Okay, so the question in this title was, is married twice? ? You cannot be married twice in the Catholic Church. You can only be sacramentally married once. And this comes from Jesus himself, who said, I keep thinking I have that slide. I forgot to put it in here. When Jesus was confronted by the Sadducees and Pharisees, and they asked him about divorce, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And Jesus said, from the beginning, it was not so. From the beginning, God made man and woman, and the man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife. And Jesus was talking there about the specialness and the indissolubility of marriage. And the Pharisees said, well, what about Moses? Moses said that you could do a bill of divorce. And by the way, a bill of divorce was a step up from what was done in the culture at the time of Moses. At the time of Moses, a man could just put away his wife for no good reason whatsoever. A bill of divorce meant it had to be judged by Moses or by one of his 72 judges, okay, that it had to go through a process. So that was a step up for the culture. But what does Jesus say about that? It is because of the hardness of your heart that Moses allowed for that, okay? And again, he says, in the beginning it was not so. So we need to be careful that we're not becoming hardened of heart. We need to be careful that we're not becoming selfish, that we're always looking to do what's necessary to exercise selfless love, because that's where the treasure lies and that's where our joy will be. Okay, I'm going to be wrapping up our look at Amoris Laetitia next week, or the next time we meet, if it doesn't happen next week. We're going to look at what mercy is. And I kind of have hinted at that already this week and last week when we talked about conscience, about what true mercy is. And when I've been talking about the need to help people get to the next level of holiness or the next level of love. That's a hint for you of what we're going to be talking about next week. So next week, what is true mercy? For those of you who are members of From the Abbey, we are going to meet right after this, and we're going to talk about Chapter 10 of our book for our book chat, From Humdrum to Holy. And the focus on Chapter 10 is on purity. So we'll talk about what purity is and what it is not. And we'll talk about how Father Edward Broom, the author of our book, tells us to grow in purity. So join us right here in the Facebook group if that's where you're watching, members. If you're not a member yet, I want to invite you, as always, to become a member. Membership on our lowest level, our postulant level, is free, and that gets you into this Facebook group where we do these weekly meetings. And just go to abbey.ws/member. That's abbey.ws/member. That will take you to a page where you can use your Facebook identification to join the membership and the Facebook group. If you're not on Facebook, you can still be a member, and you can catch the replays of our meetings in our membership area on our website. And all of those instructions will come to you when you register. Thank you for joining me. We will see you next week or next time we meet. This is summer, so I don't want to promise that we'll be meeting every week, but I'm really trying to do it. Almost didn't happen tonight. But until next time, I want to leave you again with the words of St. Paul to the Romans, Romans chapter 12. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect.